All right. This is the American YAWP, Chapter 5, The American Revolution. So, in the introduction to this chapter, we're given a little bit of a global perspective of the American Revolution and how it fits in with the rest of the world. And that is to say that the American Revolution kicks off or begins a larger trend around the world known as the Age of Revolution. The Age of Revolution will say this is a worldwide trend towards democratic government or democratic governments. And the role that the United States plays in this overall global trend is that the US is the first. So it's somewhat of a trendsetter in this regard, a democratic revolution. The date, which of course I would say is probably the most important date in perhaps all of American history, is 1776. So typically, I don't really think memorizing a whole bunch of dates is especially useful most of the time. But if there is any date to memorize or any year, you do want to know 1776. That is the year that the United States came into existence. Anything before the year 1776, we consider it still Great Britain or the British Empire, the English colonies. After 1776, we can start to talk about the United States. We can call them Americans. They're not colonists anymore. So again, that year is very important. Now, as far as this age of revolution is concerned, yes, the United States was the first one. So it's important in that a lot of other democratic revolutions got inspiration from the United States. So, people could say, oh, look what the Americans did. We can do that here too. But, there were other revolutions that were maybe more consequential or bigger. Typically the French Revolution gets thrown around. The French Revolution was, you could definitely say more significant. But the American Revolution was the first, right? It came the earliest before all the others. And like all democratic revolutions, and this is especially relevant in the United States, there are certain ideas behind these revolutionary movements. Ideas like equality and liberty and freedom. And this is going to be a constant feature of the United States going forward. And that is, how do the ideas behind the revolution map onto the practice or reality of those ideas? And our textbook gives us a clear cut example of this. And that is, how does the idea of freedom meet the reality of an institution like slavery? And of course, there are other examples of this. We might use liberty and taxation or something like that. But if you had to summarize the American project from 1776 up into the present day, it's that tension between those two things, right? The ideas for what the United States is founded upon, what it should stand for, and then how does that map onto reality and what is the practice and how have we changed and updated the reality to maybe better form these ideas. So this will be a constant feature of American history. The second section here mostly just re-summarizes what we talked about in the previous section, or sorry, the previous chapter, and that is just some of the long-term causes of the American Revolution, what was going on in the 50s, 60s, 70 years before the war, and how did that lead to the increased tension. So we'll just summarize a few of those things here. So one is constant war, and we got a clear example of a constant war in the last chapter, and that was the French and Indian War, which was fought, 1754 to about 1763. And one of the features of constant war is that wars are expensive, and the British Empire would have to create maybe different ways of facing financial burdens from constantly going to war. And the French and Indian War left the British Empire with an enormous war debt. And so the biggest threat facing Great Britain following this conflict, even though the British won, after 1763 is how to pay off this war debt. Now, this coincides with people back in the British Parliament and how they view or consider the relationship between the colonies and the British Empire. And that is to say, there's not a universal consensus. There are some disagreement. And for the most part, we can kind of break these two different thought processes in two different camps. This is referring to, and we might just clarify this question, what is the British Empire? But more specifically, what relationship or what is the relationship between empire and colonies? And this is going to be relevant, especially to this point here about war debt, namely, who's going to pay for it and how is it going to be paid? And the two different camps on the one side, they believe that Britain should rule over the colonies. In other words, that the British Empire is in a superior or dominant position versus the side that says Britain should rule with the colonies, right, through consent, that essentially the colonists are equals the British Empire. Now, an important note to make here is that the colonists see themselves as equal. We get this sentiment expressed by James Otis Jr., who actually goes a little bit beyond this notion of the colonists seeing themselves as equal. But he says, quote, "The colonists are entitled to as ample rights, liberties, and privileges as the subjects of the mother country are, and in some respects to more." So again, there's no foregone conclusion about what the relationship ought to be. There are some people that believe the British rule over the colonies. Maybe that the British should be able to force taxes on the colonies, for example, to pay off the debt, whereas others believe that it's a more equal relationship and that any taxation or any kind of plan to pay down the war debt ought to be done through colonial consent, and those two features exist. Now, as far as the long-term causes of the revolution are concerned, remember last time we specifically said that one was economic, and again, this is going back to chapter 4 in the last chapter. Specifically, a set of laws called the Navigation Acts. And the Navigation Acts were a way for the British Empire to control the trade of the colonies. Now, a lot of the colonists didn't like this, but for a very long time, a feature of the Navigation Acts, and really just a feature of British rule over the colonies, is this notion of salutary neglect. And this is typically how we describe the relationship between the British colonies and Great Britain before 1763. And it was kind of a hands-off approach, right? Salutary neglect is in reference to we'll say Britain, we'll say neglected to enforce laws, rules, and restrictions on the colonists. And so the British were pretty hands-off, right? Even though laws had been on the books for, at this point, almost 100 years, the British weren't really enforcing them. And that, in some ways enabled a lot of bad behavior. Specifically, the bad behavior worth noting here is smuggling. That is, even though the colonists should not be purchasing certain goods from certain countries like France and Spain, because the British never enforced the laws, they did it anyways. After the French and Indian War is over, the British are going to look to resolve this problem. That leads to or creates more tension. Last chapter, we also identified two other long-term causes, giving us three long-term causes of the American Revolution, as the Enlightenment, or we'll say number 2 for the Enlightenment. Enlightenment is long-term cause number 2, and the Great Awakening as long-term cause number 3. And again, just to review, the Enlightenment, this was a philosophical movement. Really, it's from the Enlightenment that we get a lot of the ideas of freedom, equality, liberty, et cetera, et cetera. People thinking about new ways to organize governments, get rid of monarchy, get rid of aristocracy, implement something like democracy and merit. And then the Great Awakening, this was a religious movement. And some of the important contributors to both of these movements, John Locke, this is an Enlightenment thinker, and John Locke's contribution, he talked about things like equality, so that nobody is born superior to anyone else. Everyone is kind of formed by their environment. Talked about things like natural rights. And it's a lot of the ideas that John Locke wrote about that end up, influencing and forming the way that the American government is created. In a somewhat similar fashion, but different, we have George Whitefield. He was a Great Awakening. He's a preacher. Again, the Great Awakening is a little bit different because this is much more of a mass movement. It's a religious movement, people going back to the religion. The Enlightenment was a little bit more for the elite classes, the educated classes, but more people would have gone to church than read John Locke, for example. But he was a Great Awakening preacher, and recall what the Great Awakening was. It was kind of like a rebellion against congregations. And we'll just say about Whitefield is that, he asked people to challenge religious authority. So what had happened in the colonies in the 30 or 40 years before the actual American Revolution takes place, there was somewhat of a revolution in the churches beforehand. And this notion of challenging authority, this notion of revolution, it happened kind of in a cultural sense. And so to go from revolting against your congregation to revolting against your governor or assemblies, it's not that culture of revolution had been fermented. Now, one last point here in terms of long-term causes is this process known as Anglicization, right? Anglicization. And Anglicization refers to, first of all, it refers to Anglo, which essentially means English speaking, and Protestant. Might define it as an ethnicity slash culture. Specifically at this time in Britain. And Anglicization is the way in which the colonists became more connected with the mother country in terms of culture. Right? So Anglicization, we might say that the colonists, more or less through trade, became more like, and in some ways closer, right? Not like physically closer, but when you have this diffusion of culture, and that's always one thing to keep in mind in history is that when people trade or exchange things, it's not just about goods and money and stuff, but it's also culture. And so, the colonists, because they had increased trade between the mother country and the colonies so much, they became more British, right? The colonists through trade became more like and closer to Britain. And the consequence of that was that the colonists came to see themselves as equal, right? That they should be entitled to all the same types of rights, protections, everything that people in the mother country have. And that was one factor that contributed to that sentiment. Section 3, the causes of the American Revolution. And here, what we really mean are the short-term causes, right? What happened in the immediate, about 15 years or so, leading up to the breakup between the 13 colonies and the British Empire. And of course, we come back once again to the 7 Years' War and the consequences of it. So, just to summarize, what sort of problems or how did the relationship change between the colonists and the British Empire after the 7 Years' War? Well, first and foremost, there's the question of the war debt. And more importantly, how slash who is to pay for it. right? That becomes a major, major problem. Another thing that we might also consider, maybe it's not at the forefront of issues at the time, is that Britain has a larger empire to govern. And, it's not just in the 13 colonies or the Americas. Remember that from the Seven Years' War, France's land now belongs to Great Britain, but it's also other places around the world. It's India, it's the Caribbean, and so the fact that Great Britain has grown in terms of its empire makes it more expensive to govern, but it also means that the British might have their attention elsewhere. The British are stretched a little bit more thin, and because of these issues, the war debt and the fact that the British is governing a larger empire, it means that reforms are needed, right? There needs to be some sort of reform. And it's going to be many of these reforms that end up being the problem, we might say, when issues begin to arise. Now, at the same time, the British are stuck, I guess, with a new king, and that is King George the Third, right? New king, say, comes to power in 1760. So as the Seven Years' War is currently being fought, and of the two different camps in Great Britain, are the colonists equal? Are they to be ruled over? George the Third very much thinks the colonies are to be ruled. Leaves colonies are to be ruled over. Now, what's interesting is that when we look at the British government, you have the king on the one hand, who, today the British king or the British monarchs, they don't really have a lot of power. Back then, they had a little bit more power, but really it's the parliament. And parliament is the group of nobles, representatives, whatever you want to call them, that they're responsible for passing the law. So, kind of like a separation of powers, right? Great Britain has a king and a parliament. The king, again, is believes the colonists ought to be ruled over, but he's not the be all end all. In fact, most of the reforms actually come from parliament, passed by parliament. And because parliament is a group, right, it's the governing body of the British Empire, because it is a group, that means that you can have some conversations about how to go about passing various reforms, whether that's to pay down the debt or control the empire or whatever the reform necessarily is be. And what we find is that the reforms that a parliament passes after the Seven Years' War are going to be constantly met by resistance in the colonies. Passed by parliament, met by resistance in the colonies. And, these are very real problems that the British Empire now has. And some of these reforms are passed, in sort of a good, passed with goodwill to solve these problems. But again, you do have those like the king that really don't think the colonists ought to have any say in it. So there's a list of different laws. We're going to go through a couple of them here and point out the ones that are, the most significant. So one we actually talked about earlier, and that was the Proclamation Line of 1763. This really prohibited colonists from settling west. All right, it was a border, a line in the sand for the colonists to say, look, or the British Empire to say to the colonists, look, stay on your side. And we talked earlier about a conflict called Pontiac's War. And this line was really designed to end violence between colonists and Native Americans. So, as a result of the Seven Years' War, the British gained more territory in the West. A lot of colonists went out to go claim that land, and it created conflicts and violent confrontations with Native Americans. What was the solution? Well, for Great Britain, it was essentially to draw a line in the sand and say, look, you colonists can't settle west here. We want to cut down on the violence, right? That type of violence didn't exist before the Seven Years' War because that land had belonged to France. Another problem that Great Britain seeks to remedy is the problem of smuggling. Remember salutary neglect from the last section. The Sugar Act can be interpreted essentially as a war on smuggling. They were now going to enforce things like the Navigation Acts. These were laws that were on the books that said, look, the British colonists can only trade with the mother country, trade with any other country is prohibited. But because the British never enforced it, smuggling, illegal trade was going on for a very long time. Now the British are going to crack down on it. Another part of the Sugar Act is that many of these crimes will be tried in what's called a vice admiralty court. And this is a naval court with no jury. All right, so if you do get accused of smuggling by the British Empire, you don't get a trial, or at least in the eyes of the colonists, you wouldn't get a fair trial in their eyes. You would essentially be put before a British judge, and that judge could just determine whether or not you were guilty or innocent. So a lot of colonists did not like this crackdown on smuggling, and they especially didn't like how those crimes were prosecuted once you did get caught under these vice admiralty courts. And another one we could point to is the Currency Act, and this restricted paper money in the colonies. And, there are more laws and more reforms that Parliament passes, but this is a good start. And really the point that I want to illustrate is that all of these reforms in some way was Great Britain exercising more control over the colonies, and the colonists began to speak about these various reforms in much broader terms. We can see the very specifics of it, right? So we might say about the proclamation line, it determines where one could or could not settle in terms of where to live. The Sugar Act tells you who you can and cannot trade with. It denies you a trial by jury. The Currency Act essentially dictates what kind of currency that you have. And so colonists began to talk about all these reforms in much broader terms under the banner of liberty. And that is to say, rather than being very specific about, okay, here's what this law does, here's what this law does, here's what this law does, the colonists simply began to think that the British Parliament or the British Empire is out to undermine our liberty. They're telling us what money to use, they're telling us what to trade, they're telling us where to live. In other words, let's cut to the chase. They're just out to take our liberty. And this was a way in which colonists living in the West, colonists living on the coast, they could find kind of common grievance and common language and begin to think of themselves a little bit more as being all in the same boat and separate from the rest of the empire. Now, of all of the reforms that were passed, again, these ones are somewhat minor, there is one significant one, right? And if you only remember one reform that happened after the Seven Years' War contributing to the American Revolution, have it be the Stamp Act. Stamp Act ends up being the most consequential of all of them. The Stamp Act comes 1765 as far as the date is concerned, if you're curious. But the Stamp Act was very specifically designed to pay off the war debt, right? The war debt is looming in the background. How and who should pay for it? In 1765, Parliament passes the Stamp Act. This is a tax on printed materials in the colonies. Right? So it's a tax on printed materials in the colonies with the purpose of paying down the debt. Now, the Stamp Act was unlike any other reform or tax that the British had ever placed on the colonies. Stamp Act was the first internal tax that the British Parliament had ever levied. And by internal, we might say taxes, we'll say, I don't know, commodities that never, maybe we'll say arrive, probably a better way of putting it is import, or leave, export, the colony. Not to say that Great Britain had never taxed the colonies before. They had taxed the colonies, but most of those taxes would have been considered external, right? These are things like imports and exports. You know, who had passed all internal taxes at this point? Well, that had been the colonial assemblies. And remember, you know, ever since the House of Burgesses was established in the Virginia colony in 1619, which would have been 150 years before these events here, colonists had been electing their own assembly members. These assemblies were legislative bodies which were passing taxes internally. And that was fine because the colonists could vote for members of their assembly. On the other hand, there's the British Parliament. British Parliament is all the way in England, and nobody in the colonies have a say in who the members of Parliament are. So the colonists don't vote for the members of Parliament. None of the colonists can be a member of Parliament. You have to come from England. And now Parliament is stepping in and placing a tax inside the colony. And the logic went that, well, the colonists accepted it, said, look, imports and exports, you know, if Parliament wants to tax those commodities, we might not like it, but okay, right? Because as soon as something leaves the colony, it's on the open water. And that's where many colonists believe, okay, the jurisdiction of the colony ends here and Britain's jurisdiction begins. So as long as it's being imported or exported, that's okay. But taxing something that never came in or never left the colony, that ended up being a big problem. And this caused a lot of uproar and a lot of resistance because this was the first time Parliament was trying to internally tax the colonies. One other thing that we might say about the Stamp Act as well is that the fact that it was on printed materials, right, it was uniquely offensive to everyone. And that is just to make the point that all colonies, in some way, shape, or form, used printed materials. You know, if we look back at some of the other early reforms, you know, the proclamation line, that really only affected people moving out west. Most colonists, in fact, weren't living in the west. They were living, you know, near the coast. The Stamp Act only affected smugglers. Right? These were mostly in the north, in northern colonies with port cities. Most people were not engaged in smuggling, and same with the Currency Act. But somehow, some way, the British managed to find a commodity that pretty much everyone used equally. So this had a way of uniting North and South, a way of uniting East and West, and urban and rural. And the resistance to the Stamp Act was something that the colonists had never exercised before, and it's something that the British Empire had never, essentially dealt with before. So we might say that the Stamp Act resistance was, say, colonial resistance to Stamp Act was intense and uniform. We have a quote about the Stamp Act from a Maryland Assembly member, right? Again, the assemblies here. It says, quote, a right to impose an internal tax on the colonies is denied. A right to regulate their trade is admitted. In other words, kind of getting back to this point here about whereas external taxes, those are acceptable. Internal taxes, that's a line that that the British have crossed, right? That you can't cross that. So resistance to the Stamp Act came in many different forms. In the at the elite level, for members of the assemblies, this was in the form of resolutions petitions, calling of assemblies, the type of resistance that you would expect from the colonial elite, a little bit more formal, a little bit more peaceful, maybe, right? They're going to write strongly worded letters back to the British Parliament demanding an end to the Stamp Act. They're going to create logical arguments. They're going to invoke their rights as British subjects or British, citizens. Two different responses. One was the Virginia Resolves, was a one of these types of petitions. We'll just call it an anti-Stamp Act resolution. There they talked about liberty, privileges, as or they invoke the liberty and privileges as being the same to British people. This was emphasizing that earlier notion that all the rights and privileges that people in Britain have, the colonists also have. But maybe more importantly, the response from the colonial elite ends up having a more significant impact down the road is something called the Stamp Act. And this was a meeting of the colonies to send a united petition to remove the Stamp Act. In other words, you can think that when the Stamp Act was passed, all of the colonies set individual petitions, right, demanding that Parliament remove the Stamp Act. Well, Parliament wasn't really, akin to responding to that. So the colonists decided, well, what if we all come together and we decide to send one single petition? And you had, I think, 9 colonies ended up meeting in New York. So that was a good idea. And maybe we should show some sort of strength in numbers. And this becomes very important when thinking about the American Revolution because we want to think for opportunities and examples for the colonies to work together, right? The colonies were always separate from each other, different economies, different political systems, and there was a barrier to uniting. But here in the Stamp Act, we find a reason to unite. And in fact, if we're keeping a score, right, if we're keeping track, this is in some sense the second opportunity for the colonists to unite together. The first one was the French and Indian War. And in that, the Albany Plan was rejected. Right? There was an opportunity for all the colonies to unite together, fight against the French, fight against the Native Americans. For the most part, when Franklin proposed this plan, hey guys, let's team up, pretty much everyone said no. Now you have, 10 years later, with this tax that all of the colonists agree is egregious, they do meet together. And this memory of meeting together is going to play a big role. So the Stamp Act Congress, meeting of the colonies to send a united petition to Parliament to remove the Stamp Act. Now, resistance does not come only from the colonial elites. It also comes from an economic level. And that is to say that when the Stamp Act was passed, the colonists boycotted British goods. They refused to buy British goods unless they removed the Stamp Act. This is sometimes called non-importation. And then you had resistance against the Stamp Act that was a little bit less formal, right? It was not as much playing to the rational arguments against the Stamp Act or outlining the long political history of why the colonists should enjoy the same rights as their British counterparts, but it was the popular protest, right? This was more violent, more about intimidation, and it occurred, right? There were several instances or several examples of popular and violent protests against the Stamp Act. A lot of stamp tax collectors, pretty much because the way it worked was that if you were going to get a piece of paper printed, you needed to go to the stamp tax collector first. They would put a stamp on your paper, you give them a little bit of money, and then you're allowed to print. So as long as you have the stamp, you were okay. But because some of these popular protests were so violent, a lot of tax collectors were scared of collecting the tax. I mean, here you can see what is happening to these with a little bit later of a tax, but Bostonians paying the excise man, the word for tax man. And there were specifically groups that had other scores to settle with the British that really took advantage of the Stamp Act. One of them was the Sons of Liberty. This was, in essence, just an anti-British organization located in Boston. And Boston was one of those cities that a lot of smugglers had got cracked down on. So these were people who were already angry at the British to begin with because of their war on smuggling. And now the Stamp Act comes along, and the Sons of Liberty see an opportunity to just dogpile or take the sentiment from the rest of the colonies and aim that anger towards the British. So they become a major vehicle of opposition to British rule. So now the colonists, or sorry, now the British Empire has to deal with all of these things. They have to deal with the fact that the colonies are united in their opposition to this tax, that there is boycotting going on and British businesses are being hurt, and there's violence and intimidation being used so effectively that in some places the tax collector can't even collect any money, right? That no money is actually coming in because the stamp tax collector is so fearful. And one slogan that came to represent the entire colonial view on this matter specifically, and really the slogan that in a lot of ways is responsible for the American Revolution. It's a slogan and position that never gets resolved, and that is the idea of no taxation without representation. Right? That becomes the war cry for the colonists. I mean, it's not a war yet, but that becomes the slogan that the colonists use to very clearly and effectively communicate their position. Right? No taxation without representation, and this is something that never gets resolved. Right? The differing opinions about representation in the colonies and taxation never gets resolved between the colonists and the British Empire. It eventually leads to the American Revolution. So what are the British to do? What they do is they decide they're going to repeal the Stamp Act entirely. Right? Parliament agrees to remove Stamp Act. That it created such a stink in the colonists that the British are losing money because the boycotting is going on. They're unable to collect taxes because of the intimidation. The Parliament agrees, okay, we're going to remove this law. We're going to get rid of the Stamp Act. And for the colonists, this is a huge victory, right? The colonists celebrate this. And maybe more importantly, one thing that they remember from the Stamp Act Congress specifically was that they look at this whole circumstance and they say that, look, when the colonists were all separate, they were ineffective at moving Parliament, right? Individual petitions were sent to remove the Stamp Act, nothing happened. But looked what happened when the colonists worked together, right? And kind of the memory that stays in the minds and hearts of the colonists moving forward is that if you want to get something done with the British Parliament, you have to work together, right? So we might just say that colonists learned the lesson from the Stamp Act that working together equals success, right? That working together equals success. But the problem's not over, right? The colonists are celebrating the repeal of the Stamp Act, but that's not the end of the story. Because when Parliament removes the Stamp Act, they pass another law to not replace it, but they pass another law at the same time, and that is the Declaratory Act. The Declaratory Act states or declares Parliament has the right to tax colonies. All right, so Parliament has taken a step back and saying, yes, we're going to repeal the Stamp Act. But this idea of no taxation without representation, we in the British Parliament, we don't agree with that. We are declaring to you colonies that we still have power over you. And it's this impasse, right? It's the insistence on no taxation without representation. It's Parliament declaring, no, we can tax you whenever we want. Doesn't matter what your representation is. That is, what the key conflict that again never really gets resolved. So the Stamp Act crisis comes and passes, but it ends up being a very important event, especially in this respect here, right? It was an opportunity for the colonists to work together and get something done. But the problem of the war debt still exists, right? This issue is still out there. And in the meantime, that's more important than anything else. So the Stamp Act is replaced with another law called the Townshend Act, or sometimes also called the Townshend Duties. These were new taxes on things like paint, lead, tea, and glass was also one of it, right, etc. And Parliament, being wise, given the history, makes these taxes as external, right? These are not going to be, it's not going to be the same type of tax. It's going to be on things that are mostly, imported into the colonies. And so when the Townshend Acts are passed in 1767, there is not the same outrage. Because again, the colonists believe that once something gets out into the water, okay, if you want to tax that, whatever. There are some in the colonies who don't like these. The Sons of Liberty already continue to protest against even these taxes, but it's really kind of an uneven response, right? It's not the same type of, uproar, we might say. But the Stamp Act had some pretty, or at least, the ways that the effect that these reforms had on the colonists had a unique way of kind of bringing the colonies together. And one way that we see that is in the homespun movement. And this was a response to the boycott of British goods. When the colonies were boycotting British goods and not wanting to buy them, they decided that they would have to make their own clothing. Textiles and clothing were one of the things that were frequently bought from the British. And this was a way for, you might say, brought the colonists together. The homespun movement was also notable because a lot of women participated in this. And this was a way of kind of showing a certain early type of American patriotism, right? If you were wearing something from this homespun movement, you weren't just doing it to serve some sort of practical goal, but you were kind of showing off your national pride, right, in some ways. Another way in which the colonists were brought closer together by the British reforms was the establishment of committees of correspondence. And the committees of correspondence, this was helped set up by members of the Sons of Liberty. It was kind of like an unofficial communication network between the colonies. Especially after the Stamp Act and, especially after the Boston Massacre, the idea that it's a good idea for the colonies to communicate with each other gains more momentum. Right? There are more people that saying, look, maybe we should communicate more. And especially with the committees of correspondence, you want to communicate free from British interference, right? There's a growing skepticism the British Parliament and everything that they're looking to do. Now, when the Townshend Revenue Acts were passed, we had said that there was not sort of the same outrage. We might just sort of make a point here. There was uneven outrage. But as we'll learn, one of the centers of outrage during this whole process is in Boston. It's sometimes been said that the British, Empire and the 13 colonies are akin to a mother and 13 children. That's the relationship, right? That Great Britain is the mother and the 13 colonies are like the 13 children. If that were the case, Massachusetts would be the problem child. And that is because during the buildup of the American Revolution, a lot of the centers or a lot of the focal points for these conflicts between the colonists and the British happen in Massachusetts. In some ways, the American Revolution begins as a revolution between Massachusetts and the British Empire, just kind of rings in all of the other colonies. And so when this uneven outrage occurred in response to these new taxes, the British had done something they'd never done before, and that was they sent troops to Boston to try and restore order, because there had been a couple of flare-ups. And for the most part, it worked out okay. We might just say of the Boston Massacre that British troops were sent to Boston to keep order. And if we think back, this is, we've gone pretty far since the days of salutary neglect. The British have been relatively hands-off with the colonies, and now in the 1760s or 1770, early 1770, there are British troops in Boston specifically, essentially, kind of ruling over the city in some ways, right? At least that's the way that the colonists would have thought about it. And so the presence of British troops in Boston didn't sit well with the local population. In fact, there was a lot of tension, a lot of fights, a lot of cursing, a lot of throwing things. This tension finally exploded in 1770 with an incident known as the Boston Massacre. This was when British troops fired into a crowd of colonists, killing, I want to say five. Five colonists were killed as a result of the Boston Massacre. Of those were killed was Crispus Attucks. This was a former slave and dock worker in Boston, sometimes said to be the first person killed. And when the Boston Massacre occurred, members of the Sons of Liberty, again, those people who are very anti-British, wanted to take advantage of this to spread anti-British sentiment to the other colonies. And so Paul Revere, who was one of the chief, you might say, actors of the Sons of Liberty, published the following image. And in this depiction, he shows the British lined up in a military formation, firing into a relatively harmless crowd. Now, the reality was that Boston Massacre was a little bit more chaotic. British soldiers, I believe, they had lost one of their comrades or one of their fellow soldiers and went out into the city to look for him. They were met by a hostile crowd of colonists who were throwing snowballs, rocks, maybe even cursing. A gunshot went off. The soldiers panicked and fired into the crowd. Paul Revere, on the other hand, wants to depict the Boston Massacre as being much more deliberate, right? That the British were in military formation. This was a massacre. Even the term massacre was coined by Paul Revere. And send this image far and wide to the colonies and say, look, the British are literally killing us in our own cities. They're killing us in our capital. And this was a level of violence that had never been experienced between the colonists and the empire before, and in fact, forces Parliament to act again. So once again, we have another crisis and a response by Parliament. And once again, Parliament is showing a willingness to back down, because here, the British Parliament essentially does two things. One is that they force, let's say, soldiers to stay in the barracks at Boston. No more wandering the streets. But maybe most importantly, they repeal all taxes that were part of Townsend, except, and this except becomes important later on, tea. All right, so all the taxes are removed except for tea, because the British don't want to see an escalation here. And, really the colonists don't want to see an escalation either. And so the hope by the British Empire is by repealing or getting rid of all the other taxes, but leaving just one on tea, this will kind of cool things off a little bit. But once we get to the Boston Massacre, it proves kind of an important point here, and that is, violence is on the table. It's, at least from the colonist perspective, it demonstrates a willingness for the British Parliament to rule over the colonies militarily. They're not afraid to use force, and just the events of the Boston Massacre itself. The ability and willingness for the British to fire into a crowd of colonists. And so, once we've got to the point of the Boston Massacre, we've kind of crossed a threshold now that violence is on the table. For as hostile as things during the Stamp Act got, and there certainly was some violence on the popular protest level. There was never any kind of sanctioned violence like this. And so as the colonists in the British Empire, kind of continue to navigate forward, and hopefully at this time, come to a peaceful conclusion, the Boston Massacre does remain in the in the minds of the decision makers on both the British and colonial side. Section 4, independence. So the fact that the British had removed taxes on all items except for tea ended up being very consequential. And when combined with the colonial position of no taxation without representation, these two ingredients created what is sometimes referred to as the last imperial crisis. Now, since the Boston Massacre, things had become quite peaceful again. It seemed like the relationship between the colonies and the British Empire was running smoothly. But in 1773, Parliament decided to pass the Tea Act. And what's interesting about the Tea Act is that the Tea Act really wasn't focused on the colonies per se. This was not one of the many reforms that the British Empire needed to do in the Americas, but instead was designed to rescue, essentially, a failing British company. That was the East India Company. You might say that East India Company was like going bankrupt. Parliament passed the Tea Act to save it. So this was really designed with the East India Company in mind. Now, what did the Tea Act do? Well, the Tea Act essentially required colonists to buy tea from the East India Company. So the idea was that, well, to save this company, let's pass a law to make sure that the colonists can only buy tea from this company, and that would provide the company with revenue so that it would no longer go bankrupt. Seems simple enough. And in fact, as a result of the Tea Act, the price of tea actually went down. So this is not necessarily a matter of dollars and cents, but here's the kicker. And that is by forcing the colonists to buy tea from this company, they were directly forcing the colonists to pay the tax on tea, and that violated the principle of no taxation without representation. So, this issue about taxation and representation, we find it unfolding here again, almost 10 years after the Stamp Act, and the colonists remain committed to this. Again, the Tea Act forced the colonists to buy tea from the East India Company. By buying it from the company, they were forcing them to pay the tea tax, which is the only tax that's remaining. By extension, that is a violation of the principle of no taxation without representation. Now, again, this idea about taxing things to be imported to the colonists, there was an uneven response. So the outcry against the Tea Act is not uniform everywhere. And of course, the one area where it does become, it's a lot bigger of a deal than other places is, of course, in Boston, where we have groups like the Sons of Liberty who are very active in promoting anything anti British at the time. And what happened in Boston is that instead of unloading the tea, you might just mention here that when the tea arrived, the Bostonians, it didn't just happen in Boston. There were a couple other places. I want to say Charlotte, South Carolina too, but Bostonians blocked it from being unloaded, right? Because once that tea was brought into the colonies, they would be subject to the tea tax, and that was unacceptable. In other places around the colonies, the tea showed up, they unloaded it, and it wasn't a big deal, right? In some places, they showed up, some colonists blocked it, and the ship left. But in Boston, you had the colonists who were out there blocking the tea from being unloaded. You had the governor of Massachusetts saying that ship is not going to leave until the tea is unloaded. And you had this showdown, right? Who was going to win? And as every night that this crisis progressed, nobody really knew what the outcome was going to be. Eventually, the colonists had enough. Instead of waiting to find out what the governor might order, instead of just blocking the tea from being unloaded, the colonists boarded the ship and dumped all the tea overboard. This event is known as the Boston Tea Party. So we might say rather than unload and pay tea tax, the Bostonians dumped the tea overboard, right? Destroying it. And when this occurred for Parliament and Parliament's perspective, this was seen as perhaps the most egregious thing that the colonists had done. Whereas before in earlier crises, we did see a willingness for Parliament to kind of back down, maybe work with the colonists a little bit, repeal some of the taxes. You could say that when the colonists dumped all the tea into the harbor, Parliament snapped, and they were going to respond with some very strict measures, right? Very strict enforceable measures. Parliament's response became known as the Coercive Acts. So the Coercive Acts, this is Parliament's response to the Tea Party, designed to punish and isolate Massachusetts. And that's an important point, is that the Coercive Acts only applied to Massachusetts. After all, it was only the people of Boston that had destroyed tea and dumped it into the harbor. So these laws did not apply to all the colonies. It was only designed to apply to one. Now, there's several pieces here, four, that make up the Coercive Acts. The colonists, they would call these intolerable acts. That would be the name that the colonists use for it. But let's just go ahead and run down these four things pretty quickly here. So the Boston Port Act shut down Boston Harbor. Till the tea is paid for. So the British are going to come in and shut down the harbor. Massachusetts Government Act, this is going to, we might say, dismiss the assembly. Again, assemblies are democratically elected and usually support the interests of the colonists, or do support the interests of the dismissed the assembly and replaced it with essentially a military dictator. That Massachusetts is now going to be under the governance of one single British general. The Administration of Justice Act, this allows for, say, soldiers or royal officials who are charged with a crime are tried in England. All right, so essentially, in short, if you're a British soldier or British royal official, if you're in the colonies and you commit a crime, your trial is going to be back in England. And the presumption is that when you get back to England, they're not going to punish you. So the Administration of Justice Act, this pretty much was allowing British soldiers to have free reign, right? You know, treat the colonists however you wish. You'll face no repercussions, right? That was the idea, anyways. And lastly, the Quartering Act, which had existed before, and it had was actually passed in all of the colonies. This required colonists to house British soldiers. Right, so Boston Tea Party happens. Parliament responds with coercive acts, punish Massachusetts, isolate Massachusetts, and that was, essentially the response. Now, the other colonies react to the coercive acts, again, as they call them, intolerable, meaning that we cannot accept it, in a way that really demonstrates how far the colonies have come up until this point. And you had always had kind of these two different opinions in the assemblies. One opinion was we're all 13 separate colonies. What happens in Massachusetts is their problem. What happens here in our colony is our problem. And that had very much been the attitude pretty much the whole time. But you also had this voice, and again, this is the voice that is growing in popularity and eventually does win out. And that is the voice that in the other colonies are saying, look, if Parliament can do all these things, right? If Parliament can shut down Massachusetts port, if they can dissolve their assembly and put in a military dictator, if they can do all these things to them, they can also do those things to us. And maybe we in the other colonies, maybe we should be concerned about what happens in Massachusetts. It's no longer their problem. It's kind of all of our problems. And by the time that we get to the coercive acts, it's actually that position that is beginning to win out, that most people in the other colonies are saying, look, we can't let Parliament do all these things to Massachusetts, because if we let Parliament kind of go this far with them, the potential is that they can do that, they could do that for us. And so, of course, the colonies are communicating with each other the emergency of the coercive acts via the committees of correspondence. But the committees of correspondence, again, this sort of unofficial network of communication, begin to take on features and characteristics of, really the assemblies themselves. And that is what we might call a provincial congress. And the provincial congresses, these were the assemblies, colonists, we say started making decisions in outside of British, we'll say, government reach. So when Great Britain, when they decided that they were going to dismiss the Massachusetts Assembly, the Massachusetts Assembly didn't just go home and sit on their hands for the next couple of months. They actually met unofficially outside the purview of the British government in a provincial Congress. And so you had these types of congresses that were beginning to sort of sprout up all over the colonies. This was further separation from the traditional means of of British governance. And a lot of these congresses had been created out of these committees of correspondence. So you have people who are resigning their positions in the British government, saying, "Look, I'm not going to be part of this anymore. I'm going to be part of really what is, being formed at this time, and that is the beginnings of an American government." And so, once again, or we should say for a third time, the coercive acts provide an opportunity for the colonies to meet. Again, first was the French and Indian War, second was the Stamp Act. Now, colonists decide to meet at the First Continental Congress, 1774. And the First Continental Congress is a meeting of the colonies that essentially say, a meeting of the colonies to remove the coercive acts from Massachusetts. They already know at this time Massachusetts is going to have a very difficult time trying to remove the coercive acts on their own. They remember the Stamp Act. They remember that in order to get things done, they need to work together. So that's the idea behind the First Continental Congress, is to demand that the coercive acts be removed from Massachusetts, because if they can do that to them, they could essentially do that to us. They outlined in their Declaration of Rights and Grievances, again, this principle that had been there for a while: no taxation without representation. They continue to demand it up until this point. They demand to a trial by jury. And they hope that Parliament's going to come to their senses and back off, kind of in the same way that they backed off with the Stamp Act. And so a lot of similar tactics are going to be used. So, for example, boycotts are going to be part of the First Continental Congress in trying to battle or convince Parliament to return from its coercive acts. But there's been a very important event that has happened in the meantime. What makes the Stamp Act different than the coercive acts, and kind of what is looming, is the Boston Massacre. At least back during the Stamp Act, there hadn't been an explicit violent confrontation, or at least nothing quite to the degree of the Boston Massacre. And now, those at the First Continental Congress, the British Parliament, they have to navigate this with the Boston Massacre essentially in mind. Now, another thing that is unique, we might say, about the First Continental Congress is this Continental Association. Continental Association was created by the First Continental Congress to enforce the boycotting. Your textbook uses non-importation. Don't get these confused. Boycotting, non-importation, they're the same thing, of British goods. And the association is it's interesting because we could, in sort of an abstract way, we might think of this enforcement mechanism as the first US law, maybe. Not, technically, not quite, but remember that, even up until this point, each individual colony, determined their own rules, laws, and policies. And any sort of law that was passed on all 13 colonies by the British Parliament, that was seen as being an action of the Parliament and not really of the colonies themselves. So the fact that you have in 1774 a declaration from the colonies to all agree to enforce some sort of law uniformly. And again, it's technically not a law, I guess, but to enforce something upon all the colonies, I mean, it's kind of like the first law in American history. Um, so we see the colonies, they begin to take shape and they begin to take form as a separate independent entity, now passing, forcing, making boycotting a law of goods. So remember back in those days, it took a while for petitions to be sent. So the First Continental Congress met, demanded that the coercive acts be removed, and sent the petition back over to England, hoping that a year later, it might take a year in those days, put it on the boat, sail across the ocean, read it, put it back. They'll meet 1 year later for the Second Continental Congress, hoping that the British will come to their senses and say, look, we're going to remove the coercive acts and try and work something out. It's in the meantime that everything falls apart, right? In the meantime, everything falls apart. So things are especially tense. The colonists are hopeful that the coercive acts will be removed. But in Massachusetts, of course, it can't be anywhere else. You essentially have, not essentially, but you have a war breakout, right? The fighting between the British colonies, fighting between the colonies and the British Empire breaks out while waiting for essentially a response to the whole coercive act Boston Tea Party situation. The first battle of the American Revolution was Lexington and Concord. This is the first battle in the Revolutionary War. And essentially, the military dictator of Massachusetts, we might say that the British general ordered the confiscation of weapons, specifically arms that were located in Concord. Minutemen, these are citizen soldiers. The idea behind a Minuteman is that, they're a regular citizen, so probably, 90% are farmers, but maybe blacksmith or something like that. But the idea is that with the British Army in the barracks in Boston, that the Minutemen need to be ready to fight at a minute's notice, right? You have to go from citizen to soldier in a minute. And when the British general, when he moved British forces out to go confiscate these weapons, these citizen soldiers went from, farmer to soldier pretty quickly, began congregating around Lexington, Massachusetts, which was a city on the way to the weapons. And it was there in Lexington that the first shots were fired in the American Revolution. Citizen soldiers, might say about them, turned out to stop British force in Lexington, shot what is known as the quote, shot heard around the world. And it was that exchange of gunfire in Lexington, Massachusetts, which was like 800 British soldiers and like 80 of these Minutemen. It was the first exchange of gunfire there that the American Revolutionary War had done. Now, as far as the remainder of the Battle of Lexington and Concord, the British did make their way all the way to Concord. They didn't really confiscate any of the weapons. Most of them had been moved by then. But then the British retreated back to Boston. Since the war was on, the colonists took it upon themselves to siege the British position. So the colonists laid siege, and siege is, kind of a military strategy of not letting the enemy leave, right? You try and keep them bottled up in position. Colonists laid siege to British in Boston. Naturally, the professional British soldiers were not too happy or satisfied with the fact that they were being laid siege to by, essentially in their eyes, a bunch of, farmers and not very professional or even good soldiers. And so the British had attempted to break the siege, and what resulted is the Battle of Bunker Hill, which is one of the earlier battles, Lexington and Concord being the first, but the Battle of Bunker Hill being one of the earlier battles of the American Revolutionary War. The Battle of Bunker Hill, we might say this is the British attempt to break siege. And what resulted was technically a British victory. That is, the colonists retreated. But it was very costly for the British. The British were on the offensive. They were marching up a hill into a colonial position. And the British suffered a lot of casualties. So, despite the fact they were able to take the hill, in fact, the casualties were too much that the British decided that it would really take some organization and planning to deal with whatever sort of outbreak of violence that this currently is. It resulted in the British abandoning Boston. And sort of an interesting note is that when the British abandoned Boston here, or 1775, early on in the war, they never returned. Even though Boston and Massachusetts had been the center for so much revolutionary activity leading up until this point, most of the Revolutionary War takes place in other places, and there's good reason for that, and we'll talk about why the British eventually do decide to do that. So fighting has broken out in Massachusetts, and the fighting is pretty significant. And this is the backdrop of the Second Continental Congress, which meets with the fighting having taken place. And so the question for the Second Continental Congress is, okay, well, what do we do with this war, right? How do we consider the war in our demand to remove the coercive acts? So again, meeting of the colonies, fighting taking place in Massachusetts. It's a very different attitude than what most expected, right? Most expected to go to the Second Continental Congress and celebrate the removal of the coercive acts, but things have gotten pretty out of control. Well, not everyone essentially agrees on exactly what to do. The Massachusetts delegation wants the Continental Congress to go up and help fight the British. Other areas of the colonies, so for example, the middle colonies like Pennsylvania, New York, they want peace, right? So Massachusetts wants to fight. Pennsylvania, New York wants peace. Southern colonies don't really know what to do. Now, the British, having abandoned Boston, it's presumed that they're going to return sometime, right? The British are, they're regrouping, they're going to organize, they're going to come back. And the question is, how ought the colonies be prepared? And at the very least, regardless of what the goal is, the goal might be to find peace, but regardless, it's in the colonists' best interest to defend themselves. And so, in fact, one of the first things, or one of the important things the Second Continental Congress does is create a continental army created by, we'll say, the Second Continental Congress. To defend from the British, right? So you can defend yourself and hope for peace at the same time. This wasn't necessarily maybe the aggressive stance that maybe Massachusetts would have wanted at the time, but at the very least, the colonists ought to defend themselves. And most importantly, they appointed George Washington as the general. So now, instead of, and the past would have been Massachusetts has a militia, Pennsylvania has a militia, New York has a militia. there never existed an army that represented all 13 colonies. So the Continental Army now, once again, is a way in which the colonies are becoming united, right? This is a fighting force that represents all 13 colonies. And the selection of George Washington, Washington had military experience, but he was also from the South. And being from the South, it was important because so far this had been such a Massachusetts northeastern British problem. By choosing a Southerner like Washington, it showed a little bit more that the colonies were united. The Second Continental Congress allowed for the creation of a continental army, but it also issued what was known as an olive branch petition. And the olive branch petition, this might be called the last effort to find peace with Britain. This was dismissed by Parliament. That is to say, as late as the Second Continental Congress, there are still some people who are, who are trying peace. Now, in the eyes of King George III, he interpreted these events as being pretty drastic. King George III says, quote, or the colonists are, quote, misled by dangerous and ill-designing men who are traitorously preparing, ordering, and levying war against us for the purpose of establishing an independent empire, King George III, 1775. And so, this, I don't want to say it's important, but, it's interesting to note that King George in 1775, is essentially declaring independence on behalf of the colonies because the colonists, even at this point, haven't unanimously decided that yet. That, we know how the rest of the story plays out. So yeah, this is going to be an independent movement. But the response from the king, anyways, and there are some that suggest, perhaps if George would have responded differently, there could have been a route or a possibility for a peaceful relation. At least from George's perspective, the revolution's on, right? I mean, the colonists are have to be dealt with in in certain ways, but there's still a little bit of debate to go on in the colonies. But from 1775 to 1776, there are a few incidents that push some of the colonists that are a little bit hesitant about declaring independence onto the side of wanting a breakaway. One of them is the publication of Thomas Paine's Common Sense. This is a political pamphlet that makes an argument for independence. And it comes out right on the eve of the American Revolution. It's the most widely read political, or I think it's I think the only thing people read more was the Bible. It was like second in terms of how people read it. And, it's pretty straightforward. It made the case for independence. And there were a lot of people, in that short period of time who were exposed to Thomas Paine's Common Sense, were convinced by it and decided, okay, yes, we should vote for independence. And one of the things that made Common Sense especially effective was that it was written so everyone could understand. A lot of talk about, Enlightenment thought and philosophy, and it was very intellectual, kind of went above everyone's head. Uh, Thomas Paine made the argument in a way that was easy for, again, everyday people to sort of understand. So, this is a great quote that comes from Thomas Paine, and we can see how this would have appealed to people at the time. He says, "quote There is something absurd in supposing a continent to be ruled perpetually, or sorry, to be perpetually governed by an island." And that was just pointing out the fact that the 13 colonies were big, the British Isles were small. Why should the small thing rule the big thing? And again, you don't really need to know anything about politics or forms of government or anything like that to say, yeah, we're bigger than them. They shouldn't tell us what to do. Again, that was part of the effectiveness of of common sense. At the same time, where some of the southern colonies were split, there was an incident that ends up pushing many of the southern colonies in favor of independence. For the most part, there wasn't really a lot of tension between the southern colonies and the British Empire because they both had the purpose of making money. But as events were unfolding in Massachusetts, the royal governor of Virginia, Lord Dunmore, issues a proclamation that is not taken well, especially by the slave-holding class in the southern colonies. So Lord Dunmore's proclamation. Lord Dunmore was governor of Virginia. Governor of Virginia. And he offered freedom for enslaved men to fight in the British Army. Essentially, Dunmore saw what happened in Massachusetts, was fearful perhaps that the colonists in Virginia might, use some sort of armed response against him, and he wanted to boost up the militia down there, or he wanted to boost up British forces. And so he made a proclamation saying, look, if there's any enslaved person that is willing to fight for the British Army, you'll be granted your freedom. Now, the way that the colonists interpreted it is that Southern colonists especially saw it as an attack on slavery. And so there were some in the South that looked at Lord Dunmore's proclamation and figured that their interests as the slave-holding class in the colonies would be better suited if they advocated for revolution as opposed to remaining part of the British Empire. And so, again, some Southern colonists that were maybe on the fence about should we declare independence, should we not declare independence, Lord Dunmore's proclamation pushed them into the side of independence. And so by 1776, for the most part, those at the Second Continental Congress were prepared and ready to declare independence or declare separation from Great Britain. The document that was created, the Declaration of Independence, was written by Thomas Jefferson and declared, I guess you could say, on July 4th, 1776. So the Declaration of Independence, for the most part, what it is simply a list of, we'll say, grievances the British Empire as, we'll say, forced on the colonies. It was written by Jefferson. It was a group project, but Jefferson did most of the writing. Edits were by John Adams. And it's edited. And Ben Franklin. And it was a declaration to the rest of the world, the reasons why the United States was separating politically from the British Empire. And if you go in and actually read the Declaration of Independence, again, it's pretty much just a list of all the things that the British Empire had done to the colonies. You taxed us without our consent. You closed down our ports. You forced soldiers in our home. You told us where we couldn't migrate and stuff like that. So it's like, you did this wrong, you did this wrong, you did this wrong, you did this wrong, you did this wrong. Therefore, we are breaking away. But without that being said, the most significant part of the Declaration of Independence is not the core of the document itself. It's actually the first couple of paragraphs known as the preamble, because the Declaration is not a governing document, right? We're not, it doesn't constrain what we do today. It was very simple. It was just a declaration to the world as to why the colonies are breaking away. However, though, where the Declaration of Independence is important is much more in this preamble. because it outlines not just the reasons why the United States is coming into existence, but it sort of broadly describes the role and relationship between governments and people. And now that we're separated, well, 2 points. One is that when the Declaration of Independence was first written, the United States said, "Look, we're going to be an independent country," but that really didn't mean anything without victory in the war. And so, had the Declaration of Independence been written, signed, and then the Americans lost the war, this document would essentially not mean very much at all, right? So there's still a war to go on, right? So Declaration of Independence is signed, the colonists intend to break away, but you still have to beat the British on the battlefield. So, independence, we say 1776. Technically, our independence wasn't secured until after the war. But the second point is that in this preamble, it outlines the founding principles for which the United States was created. And when we talked earlier about this notion of ideas and reality, right? Or I think actually it was not ideas and reality, but was ideas and practice. A lot of the ideas are embedded in this preamble, and it's the effort or the project really in the United States to try and create a government and society that can live up to this, however imperfect it ends up, being. And so when we think about the Declaration of Independence, really the significance is that it outlines founding principles and ideas for what this country should be, right? So we'll just go ahead and read the preamble here from the Declaration. It says, quote, "We hold these truths to be self-evident, that all men are created equal, that they're endowed by their Creator with certain unalienable rights. Among these are life, liberty, and pursuit of happiness. That to secure these rights, governments are instituted among men, deriving their just powers from the consent of the governed, taxation and representation. That whenever any form of government becomes destructive to these ends, it is the right of the people to alter or abolish it," right? So there's a lot in there, right? The notions of equality, of unalienable rights, human rights, life, liberty, happiness, consent of the governed. And when we look at the declaration in the long term, again, in the short term, there's still a war that needs to be fought, right? This might end up not being as significant as they hoped at the time. But the significance in the long term is that not only was the American Revolutionary War successful, but democratic revolutions around the world were successful. And you could find people from every corner of the world um, quoting from the Declaration of Independence. And so the sort of the reach, we might say, that this document had, it's been much more than just a simple declaration of separation of colonies and British Empire back in 1776. I mean, it's really influenced the entire world in some pretty significant ways. Section 5, the War for Independence. So let us recall that the war and the movement to break away are, at this point, anyways, have been two distinct things. That, in fact, with those two, the decision to declare independence and the actual fighting that took place, was actually the war that started first, right? It's, when we think about the American Revolution, it is a war broke out and then independence was declared, not the other way around, right? It's not as if the colonists declared independence and then a war broke out. The fighting actually started first. And, up until 1776, these were actually two separate things, right? There was the fighting that was taking place. Minutes. There was fighting that was taking place, and then there was a debate about whether or not the colonists should create their own country. After 1776, these two things become the same in what we might describe as the War for Independence. And it becomes a very simple equation at this point, and that is if the colonists win the war, they become an independent nation. If the colonists lose the war, they remain part of the British Empire. So after the British Army evacuated Boston, they decided to place their attack, or they decided to invade New York. New York was, we'll say, the British captured New York. The British Army is successful very early on. Washington was defeated and had to retreat. Now, certainly it was going to be a long shot for the colonists to win this war. The British Empire was, had far more resources, had a better army, better navy, more people. But there were some things that the Americans had working on their side. One was that they were fighting on home soil. That is, the British were required to come into the colonies to conduct this war. And so fighting a defensive war or fighting a war on familiar geography was something at least that the Americans had. The British also used a lot of Hessians in their army. A Hessian is a German soldier for hire. I also describe them as a mercenary. Now, it's not to say that the colonists didn't use any mercenaries. They certainly did use soldiers well. But the use of Hessians by the British military might also give us a little bit of a clue for what might be a second advantage. And again, this isn't always perfect, but we could say that the morale was an advantage on the colonist side. That is, morale is kind of like fighting spirit, right? What are you fighting for? And, on the surface, you could say the Americans or the colonists are fighting to be an independent country. They're fighting for the ideas of freedom, equality, and liberty. These are very powerful ideas. Whereas if you're a mercenary, you're fighting for a paycheck at the end of the day. But maybe more realistically is that, when you put these two things together, the fact that it was being fought on the colonists' home soil, and then the fact that the Americans maybe had stronger morale, well, what that boiled down to was that a lot of Americans, especially during the end phase of the war, were fighting for their homes, right? Because it was their communities and their churches and their neighborhoods that were being invaded. So for anything else, you might have people who are just more strongly motivated by the very realistic and practical presence of British soldiers on American soil. Again, everything else, money, soldiers, weapons, training, navy, all of those are advantages for the British. Again, these might be some advantages. We say, look, hey, the Americans had some things going for them. Now, during the course of the war, it's important to understand that the colonies were not united in their effort to declare independence and defeat the British on the battlefield. In fact, Americans were divided into primarily two camps, technically three, but primarily two. A loyalist was someone who wanted the British to win. They wanted to remain part of the empire. They wanted to see this revolution movement crushed. A patriot wanted the Americans to win. Patriots would have been all of those who signed the Declaration of Independence. They wanted to separate from Great Britain. And then we have a third camp of kind of like don't care, right? Or neutral, right? They could go either way. They don't really care too much. And the way that this broke down in colonial society at the time was that only about 33% considered themselves patriots, as actively supporting the revolutionary movement. 33% were actively against the revolutionary movement. They wanted the British to win, and about 33% didn't care. That is to say that when it came to independence, when it came to the desire for the United States to become a new country, really only a minority of colonists actually wanted that. And so one of the things that that plays out during the course of the wars is which side are you on? And colonists could look at each other maybe a little bit suspiciously. Are you a patriot? Are you a loyalist? Do you want to be vocal about that? If you are a loyalist, do you want to make yourself known? So it's not to say that the American Revolution is, a full-blown civil war, but it does have some characteristics of that. Now, as far as the actual fighting is concerned, we're not going to go over all of the battles, the battles and the military movements and strategies and tactics, those that's not really important here. Here we want to kind of get more of an overview and causes and consequences, but we will talk about a couple of important battles. One important battle was the Battle of Trenton. Trenton was one of the rare American victories in the early phase of the war. Remember early on that George Washington was not able to defend New York, and so Washington was forced to retreat. And pretty much Washington would spend the rest of the war retreating from the British Army. He couldn't defeat them in a straight up battle. But Washington desperately needed a victory for good publicity, right? It didn't look well for the Americans to continue to either A, not fight any battles, or B, lose every single battle that you fight with. So this caused Washington to resort with or use unconventional tactics, right? If you can't do it the conventional way, use unconventional tactics. And the Battle of Trenton is a perfect example of this. This is when Washington, say, surprise act Hessians by crossing a frozen Delaware River at midnight on Christmas. Right, so a lot of unconventional things there. Moving your army at night typically didn't do that. Attacking during the winter, during poor weather conditions, you typically didn't do that either. Crossing a river at nighttime, you typically also didn't do that. And attacking on Christmas, right? You also typically didn't do that. Why did Washington make such a risky or unconventional attack? Well, in some sense, desperate times call for desperate measures. And the point is that even though this didn't really have a huge, it didn't really weigh on the overall outcome of the war very much. It was a success. The Americans could proclaim victory, and that's exactly what they did. And so, they could publish in the newspaper, Washington, captured a bunch of these Hessians. This is some good news that the Americans can feel better about. And it helped with things like enlistments, morale, stuff like that. Now, out of all the battles in the entire American Revolution, there was one that is by far more important than the rest, and that is the Battle of Saratoga. The Battle of Saratoga was also one of the more rare victories by the United States. This was an American victory. Over the British Army, New York. Essentially, the British had already successfully captured New York City. They were on their way to Philadelphia, and a reinforcing army was coming from Canada. As that reinforcing army was coming from Canada, the Americans intercepted it and defeated it. So it was important then that it kept the British army, divided. It didn't allow the army that was already causing so much trouble to grow bigger. But more importantly, it was the news of American victory in Saratoga that would influence events in France. And that is because during the Revolutionary War, Benjamin Franklin was in France trying to build an alliance. Ben Franklin was in France trying to get French support. And it was US victory in Saratoga, say, convinced France to help the US. The French, who had been enemies of the British for a very long time, the British took all their land in the 7 Years' War, so the French wanted revenge, but they didn't think the Americans could win. And the French were willing to help the United States if they could prove they could win a significant battle. And so when Benjamin Franklin heard that the Americans had won at the Battle of Saratoga, he was able to use that in order to convince the French to help the US, which is essentially what they did. So, because of the victory at the Battle of Saratoga, France now joins the side of the US. And so that's why we consider the Battle of Saratoga to be the turning point of the war. Because now, with French help, it's going to make it a lot easier for the Americans to win over the British. And, this is one of those questions that we'll never have a definitive answer to because we can't go back in time and do history differently. But it's very hard to imagine the Americans winning without French help. France had a lot of money, a navy, they had weapons, they had experienced soldiers. And so, would the Americans have won without French help? Probably not, right? Probably not. Again, we'll never know that, but probably not. So this was a huge, huge help. Despite that, though, the war continued on. And in fact, there was even more bad news, at least from the colonial side. Philadelphia, which was the capital of the 13 colonies in many respects, was also captured by the British. And so that put the two largest cities, New York and Philadelphia, in British hands. Now, typically, if you think about the conventional war, capturing the two largest cities of a country and capturing what is effectively the capital city, those are generally good victory conditions. I mean, that's typically the goal. What the British found was that despite the fact they occupied the two largest cities in the 13 colonies, the revolution wasn't going anywhere. Washington remained out there with the Continental Army, and the British were still unable to capture him. The British military commanders used to talk about George Washington like they were fox hunting. They needed to go out and bag the fox. And as long as Washington was out there somewhere, the American Revolution would continue, despite how many cities the British occupied. Now, they occupied New York and Philadelphia. They found that the revolutionary movement wasn't going anywhere, and so they decided to change up their strategy a little bit, and that was to attack the South. And the British, we would say, occupied, and in some cases terrorized the southern colonies. And what they wanted to do was to exploit the loyalists, right? There was a belief that, at least in the very South, there was a little bit more support for the British side. They also began to enlist colonists into the British Army. The British were always very careful about only using soldiers from Great Britain. But, in the colonies, things turned south, or sorry, turned south. Yeah, play on words. In the With the British invasion of the South, things turned ugly. It was a war of occupation. It was a war in which civilians were terrorized by the occupying British army. Really, the Americans couldn't stop it, so the British just kind of rampaged throughout. Because they enlisted fellow colonists into the British army, a lot of the fighting, or much of the fighting, took on an aspect of a civil war where colonists was killing other colonists. But once again, Washington remained elusive, and the British could rampage throughout the South as much as they wanted to. But the revolution itself was not going to come to conclusion. Now, the war had been going on for quite some time at this point, and an important thing to kind of consider here is expectations. The British went into this war seeking a quick victory, right? They thought, rightfully so, they had the superior everything. And so, this revolution should be crushed relatively soon. And the longer that the war drawn out, even though the British won a lot of battles, the public was getting pretty impatient with what was going on. And so the final straw that broke the camel's back to eventually cause the British to throw in the towel was in Yorktown. After rampaging throughout the South, the British Army had stationed themselves in Yorktown awaiting reinforcements and supplies, and they were going to continue their war effort. But George Washington, with the Continental Army, was working with the French Navy, and they executed a strategy to trap the British Army. And at the Battle of Yorktown, we'll say Washington and the French Navy coordinated a, we'll say, trap of the British Army, which then surrendered. This is a famous portrait here of the British Army surrendering to George Washington. Um, when the British Army surrendered at Yorktown, that sparked a crisis back at home in Great Britain, which eventually forced the British to give up trying to suppress the rebellion. And so, Yorktown, we consider Yorktown to be the last battle of the Revolution. Last battle. The Revolutionary War came to a conclusion after. So, what were the costs of the war? Well, all sides paid the price in some way, shape, or form, right? Victory came at a cost. For the colonists, or for the Americans, they endured. And this was especially tough given the circumstances on the battlefield in which, again, the British Army occupying places like New York and Philadelphia could live it up. They could throw, elaborate parties. You had British soldiers that were sleeping in Benjamin Franklin's bed. George Washington and the Continental Army, meanwhile, they had to elude all of this. They were pretty much on the run, and in the process endured some pretty tough conditions. Probably none more tough than the winter at Valley Forge. And during the winter at Valley Forge, the Continental Army suffered 2,500 Americans died of disease and we'll say exposure. So even though victory came, it certainly did have its costs, and it's not just those who lost their lives on the battlefield, but those who had to go through, episodes like the winter at Valley Forge, which was especially a low point. It was true that women also contributed to the war and also burdened some of the costs. Typical for the time period was that women took on traditional male responsibilities. So things like land ownership or running a business. It could also involve being something like a camp aide. Women contributed to assisting the armies in more hands-on ways. Women were spies during the Revolutionary War, transferring information back and forth. So taking on additional burdens that traditionally men have was one way that women, participated or shared in the cost of the conflict. For Black Americans, the war, more so than anything else, provide an opportunity for those who were enslaved, the chaos or the guise to escape. We'll talk a little bit later more about the impact of the American Revolution on slavery, but we could just say here that the chaos of the war provided opportunity for some enslaved to escape. Black Americans also participated in the in the fighting. On the British side, things like Lord Dunmore's proclamation. The soldiers that took advantage of Lord Dunmore's proclamation, those who had escaped slavery and fought for the British, they were called the Ethiopian Brigade. And in some militias, there were some Black Americans that fought for the Continental side. If you had to weigh the numbers, probably more so on the side of the British. But again, the general chaos of the war, especially as the British more or less rampaged throughout the South and as slave owners lead their plantations, that was the chance for those who were enslaved to escape. For the Patriots, the Patriots, they got what they wanted, right? They got a new country, but the cost was economic. And the situation or the state of the American economy will have consequences down the line. One example was that the colonists didn't really have a lot of money, so they printed a lot of it. So there's a lot of inflation. The colonists could not pay their soldiers, so they issued things like IOUs. The British had a navy, and the British had a far superior navy, and because of that, they effectively cut off all trade. The United States was under an embargo for 8 years. This destroyed the colonial economy. So, make it a simple description. The American Revolution, despite the fact that it led to the creation of a new country, left the American economy in a very, very, very bad place. The last section, consequences of the American Revolution. So we're going to list out 5 consequences that just broadly describe what resulted from the revolution once it was completed. The American victory ensured that a brand new country would be created, that would be the United States, and this new country would need a new government. And so one of the consequences is that it created new governments, using governments plural here, and constitutions, right? A constitution is the written document that more or less outlines and structures and provides the rule for a government. An important point to note here is that it actually resulted in the creation of 14 new constitutions. That was, each individual state would have their own government and their own constitution, plus one national government or constitution. So there are essentially 14 different governments and constitutions that are being created here. 13 states, 13 colonies become 13 states now. We don't call them colonies anymore, we call them states. And then one national government. Another one is increased political participation, right? Democracy. Going to be a more open system as far as participation is concerned, especially compared to what came before it and compared to other places around the world at the time. There's going to be a legalized or legal religious toleration. This was something that, given the history up until that point, going back to the wars of religion, even during the colonial period, certain colonies had, official state religions and whatnot. So legal religious toleration ended up being a pretty considerable thing given the time period in the history of religious strife. Open Western settlements. Now that the Americans are free from British rule or free from British control, consider or remember proclamation line, the line in the sand the British had created to prevent settlers from moving out west to try and stop violence. That proclamation line is null and void. That no longer exists. And so now Americans can go out into the west and settle that land at a greater rate than they could before. And then we might say new economic opportunities. And no longer under British control. The types of taxes, the types of regulations, the Americans don't have to follow these things anymore. There's kind of a new freedom when it comes to the economy, and Americans are going to have to navigate those things. So very broadly, we can just point to to these five different things, and we'll get a little bit more into the into the specifics. So first and foremost, the project after the American Revolution was to build governments, and working off of Enlightenment ideas and working off of historical examples, essentially what each state had the opportunity to do was essentially create governments from scratch. Now, there were some things that all state constitutions had in common, although each individual state government was different. So, again, each state can make their own government. Of the state constitutions, the things that they had in common were they were all written. This might strike us as obvious, right? Is there any type of government that isn't written? Well, the answer is actually most governments for most of human history were unwritten, including that of Great Britain at the time. Typically those who are in power don't want to have a written constitution to constrain to constrain themselves. And so the fact that all constitutions were written, again, seems like common today, but at the time actually was somewhat new. They all believed, or they all had this notion of popular sovereignty, right? That power comes from the people. What kind of what is the legitimate basis for power in these governments? Well, they all more or less agreed that it was with the people, right? By the people, for the people, not anywhere else. And generally speaking, weak governors. This was sort of reflective of the fact that a lot of Americans were skeptical of a monarch or a king, and strong congresses, trying to put more emphasis on the people. So certainly, if we were to think about sort of governing systems as being tyrannical on one side and democratic on the other, certainly was a move towards democracy. Now, there were some interesting features about some of these state constitutions. You don't need to know all the state constitutions, all 13 of them, but it is kind of interesting to note of some of the more unique features. So, for example, in Virginia, they created something called a Bill of Rights. And a Bill of Rights really constrains the power of governments. All right, so this was a list of rights that people have that the government would essentially never take away. So it's a limiting document as far as the reach of governing power goes. In Pennsylvania, they attempted to make what would be the most democratic government, giving most of the power to the people and being very skeptical of putting that power into too few hands. So, for example, we'll say of Pennsylvania, most radical. The formation of their government was one, I guess this is redundant, but one unicameral Congress and no governor. In fact, Pennsylvania didn't even have an executive branch. And the idea is that a governor is a little bit too similar to a king, so we can go without a king, right? We can truly put the power in the hands of all the people, or that was the belief, right? The intention. All free men could vote. And this was different because in many of the other colonies, property was required. Property required. At the end of the day, Pennsylvania's very open and very democratic system, it ended up being not as efficient as some of the other state governments, and so we typically would say it's the most radical, but didn't sort of flourish in the way that many had hoped. But very interesting nonetheless. Especially with this creation of a one unicameral legislative branch and then no governor. In Massachusetts built a pretty balanced system, probably the most balanced. They had three branches. Those three branches were executive, legislative, and judicial. So all of this, government making, state making process was underway. And what's kind of fascinating is that, in fact, most of the founding fathers at the time were much more interested in putting together their state governments than putting together a national government. So, Benjamin Franklin would have been, more concerned about Pennsylvania than he was the United States, and John Adams more concerned about Massachusetts than the United States. And so, once the state governments were underway and got, I would say, the most of the attention, or at least a good share of it, it then became time for the leaders of the nation to create a national government. So by the time that this process was over, each of the 13 states have a government. Now it's time for the national government. In the Articles of Confederation, this is the first national government in U.S. history. We could also call it the first constitution. First constitution. Luckily for us, as students of American history, we've only had two constitutions in US history. So you only need to learn two of them. This is the first one, and it doesn't last very long. The Constitution that we have today, we just call it the Constitution. It's been our second Constitution, and continues to be in effect. But the first one was called the Articles of Confederation, and some of the important features of the Articles is that it was made up of one Congress, and for the most part, the Congress was just kind of grandfathered in from the Second Continental Congress. Much of the structure of the Articles of Confederation was just building off what the colonists had already established during the American Revolutionary War and the way that they made decisions then. And the way they made decisions then is that simply representatives from the colonies just met in one room. So that was it. It was one Congress. And in that Congress, each state had one vote. Right? So that would give us, at least at this time, 13 votes. Right? That is the idea. And so there wasn't a lot of shift from the decision-making structure from the Revolutionary War, now that the Revolutionary War was over. But the most important thing about the Articles of Confederation is, in fact, the things that it couldn't do. Because if there's anything to remember about this document, is that A, it failed, and because of its failure, maybe it makes this this point a little bit easier to remember. And that is, the Articles of Confederation was too weak to function. It was not given enough tools to make it a strong government to solve the problems of the day. And that's why we only had it for, 10 years or something like that, before it was decided to completely get rid of it. So what do we mean by too weak? Well, it just wasn't given the tools to solve problems. So I'll give you some examples. No power. So these are the powers that the Confederation does not have. Tax, regulate the economy. No federal judicial. No executive, right? There's no president of the United States during the Articles of Confederation. They sort of took a page, because they maybe out of Pennsylvania's book, right? There was no executive, and no, we'll say, conscription, or raising something like an army. So the fact that the Articles couldn't do these things meant that they couldn't solve a lot of problems. Now the question is, well, why did the founders create such a weak government? And we have to remember the historical time period, and that is, the Americans just got done fighting a revolution against a government they believed to be too tyrannical and overreaching. So there was a certain fear of centralized power. So who did have all these powers? Who could tax? Who could regulate the economy? Who could conscript? Who an executive? That all fell to the states. Right. And so, one way of thinking about the Articles of Confederation is that it was more like a treaty between the states. Like, it was almost as if the states themselves were independent countries, And then they just kind of agreed to loosely work together when it was necessary. But as we will see here in the next chapter, there are some serious problems, and the inability for the Confederation to solve those problems will eventually lead to the leaders of the nation saying, look, we need a new government that can function, right? So again, the Articles of Confederation, too weak to function, and so we end up getting rid of it. Now, one of the things that Americans did and would continue to try and do really throughout American history is to again put the ideas versus the practice, right? The ideas versus the practice. And for everything that the American Revolution was, there were some ways in which the revolution didn't change all that much. In fact, there's a way to look at the American Revolution and say, well, look, actually, if we look at A, B, C, and D, these things didn't change. So maybe it's not that much of a revolution, right? Revolution implies change. Maybe it was more like a rebellion, that for the most part, other things stayed the same, and that there were certain limits to what could be changed, right? Limits to maybe some of the progress at the time. So these are going to be some examples of some of the limits of the American Revolution, maybe how it didn't go far enough in some certain aspects. One of the most clear examples is the status of women. Women did not see a dramatic change in their political, social, economic, or legal status. Women were excluded from voting and holding office. Right, and that is to say, not much change. Right? Probably, maybe the most clear example. However, there were some change, right? And so, excluded from other avenues of participating in, civic life, not being able to vote, not being able to hold office, it didn't mean that women didn't have any role in the new nation. One of the ways in which women's responsibility to their countries, or ways in which women could serve their countries that was popularized at the time, was called Republican motherhood. Republican motherhood is the idea that women serve the new nation as mothers. So your responsibility is to have children and to raise and educate the next generation of patriots, right? In other words, whose responsibility was it to teach the next generation about the heroes of the American Revolution, about the ideas? Well, society deemed that it was mothers who were to do this, and this was often portrayed in things like popular culture. I mean, it was embedded in law in the way in which women were excluded from other avenues. And you might say, if you're to say, did anything change as a result of the American Revolution and the status of women? You could make an argument that it became more acceptable for women to be in roles as educators or teachers, but no sweeping changes as far as political participation. As far as loyalists are concerned, right? Again, loyalists, those were the ones that wanted the British to win, and now they find themselves in a very tricky situation, right? They advocated for the Americans to lose. They were on the wrong side of that, and now they find themselves in enemy territory. And for the most part, the loyalists just leave, right? 60,000 loyalists leave the US. And most of this is just out of fear of what potential repercussions can happen from it. What about the status of slavery? Well, fundamentally, if we look at the entire nation, the American Revolution did not abolish slavery, right? The Revolution, and this was, especially considering the rhetoric about equality and liberty, Revolution did not abolish slavery. But that's not to say that it didn't have any impact on it, because it certainly did. And one thing that we might, point to is that the rhetoric of the revolution, right? If it's a nation that supposes itself to be founded on freedom and equality and liberty, that type of rhetoric made it harder to justify slavery. So, in some sense, the rhetoric will help bring the issue of slavery to the forefront and will open up some very challenging debates and conversations over the institution and how the United States is going to press forward. Similarly, because the revolution did not abolish slavery in the USA, it's not to say that it didn't abolish slavery in parts of the USA, because there were certain regions that, where it did lead to that. One of the effects of creating 13 states with 13 governments is that each state could potentially choose what laws they wanted regarding slavery. Again, for the most part, slavery was not something decided by the national government that was set down to the states, so each state could have their own laws. In some slave states, they passed what were called manumission laws. This allowed enslavers to emancipate their slaves if they wanted. So, if you were someone that was moved enough by the rhetoric of the revolution that you wanted to emancipate those who you had enslaved, there were laws that were passed that allowed you to do that. And perhaps the most famous example of, the most famous manumission is, of course, that of George Washington. George Washington, the general, and we don't know this yet, but he's the first president of the United States. Wrote in his will that when he died, that his slaves would be free. There were other people who used that. Maybe about 20% of those who were enslaved got their freedom from these laws. The majority of those in the slave states remained enslaved. But Washington's probably the most famous example of a manumission. Northern states allowed for gradual emancipation. Again, each state can determine laws. And because many northern states were not dependent on slave labor, because those who were part of the governments were not of the enslaving class, it was much easier for northern states to move towards gradual emancipation. Gradual emancipation, we'll say, used by northern states after the revolution. So this will put the United States on a track. We're not there yet, but we're going to be going there in the future. And that is to say, as time goes on, north and south will go two different directions. As the north will move towards gradual emancipation. Usually gradual emancipation was something like everyone who's currently enslaved remains in that condition, but their children will be free. Or it might put like an age limit, right? If you're enslaved and once you become over the age of 25, then you become free. So over time, slavery is going to become less and less and less present in the North, eventually leading to slavery being completely abolished. Whereas the South, they're going to maintain slavery, not just maintain it, but also grow it. And so it puts the northern and southern states on essentially the rails or the paths towards what eventually culminates in the American Civil War, the free states versus the slave states. So as far as slavery is concerned, again, slavery continued to persist in the United States. The rhetoric made it more difficult, but each individual state could have their own laws, and northern states moved towards emancipation. The last thing is the impact on Native Americans. And in some ways, we might say that the status of Native Americans did not change all that much, but also did change. The biggest change as far as Native Americans were concerned was that now the British were no longer able to enforce the proclamation line. So Native Americans, you might say, still felt the pressure of U.S. settlement, right? And the pressure of U.S. settlement or European settlement, that was the same, right? That had been there ever since Jamestown. But what was different was that now the British were not present to control it. So, in some sense, it's different in that there is more settlement going on. But as far as Native Americans being considered simply an obstacle to American development, or European development or European settlement, that more or less remains the same.